Those hoping for a de-escalation of the conflict in Gaza might just find Benjamin Netanyahu's latest comments a bit concerning. We established a simple principle. Whoever hurts us, we hurt him. We are preparing to meet the security needs of the State of Israel, both in defence and in attack. The Israeli Prime Minister making those comments on a visit to an airbase in the south of the country. But to whom were they directed? The conventional wisdom is Iran. They back Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, both of which have caused Israel significant issues, not to forget their support of Hamas in Gaza. So on the 1st of April, Israel struck the Iranian consulate in Syria's capital, Damascus, next door to its embassy, in fact. The attack killed 16 people, including a senior member of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran has vowed to retaliate, and the expectation is that it is coming imminently. That prompted the US president to offer his ironclad support for Israel, Joe Biden stating explicitly that he would do all he could to protect the United States' key regional ally. I'm Niall Paterson, and on this edition of The Daily, we'll be asking what the consequences will be, immediate and long-term, of any Iranian retaliation, and why Israel seems so hell-bent on provoking it. Later, we'll explore the options Iran has for its response and take a look a little bit more deeply at the US president's remarks. But we begin with Sky's Middle East correspondent Ali Bunkall. Alistair, take us back to Damascus. Exactly why did the Israelis strike the Iranians there?
It goes back to April the 1st, this particular incident. And Damascus, the Syrian capital, really not very far as the crow flies from the northern Israeli border. And the Israelis, although they've never admitted it, I have to say, took out a senior Iranian commander and some of his colleagues as well. So 7 in total killed. But really the person we're focusing on is a guy called General Mohammad Zahidi. And he was a senior commander in what's known as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the personal army, effectively, of the Iranian supreme leader. And Zahidi was a senior figure in the Quds Force, and that is the foreign operations arm that has so much control of and influence over the Iranian proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, for example. And this guy, Zahidi, was said to be very, very close to Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group. So close, in fact, that he was the only non-Lebanese to sit on their 8-man Shura Council, effectively one of their sort of governing bodies. And so for Israel, he was always going to be a target. Why they carried out the strike then, we don't know. It could have just been opportunistic.
But certainly we can say with certainty that this is not the only attack that the Israelis have carried out against the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps.
There are quite a lot of attacks, airstrikes that take place over the border in Syria and the outskirts of Damascus, but also Lebanon as well. Now, the Israelis tend to have a policy of not admitting their involvement. Everybody knows it is Israel. It's what's called a shadow war. So the Israelis are regularly taking out supply routes or weapons depots or key individuals who they believe are part of Iran's attempts to arm and train the likes of Hezbollah. So it's Israel's way of keeping the threat down, if you like.
But they must have done this with an expectation of retaliation, given the seniority, given the individuals involved.
Well, yes and no. No, not necessarily, because they have assassinated key leaders before. There was a key Hamas leader taken out in Beirut a couple of months ago, and that didn't really elicit any kind of retaliation of note. After Soleimani was killed by the Americans outside Baghdad airport, a major figure in the Iranian military, and again, there wasn't really much of a retaliation there. So it might have been that the Israelis, who have been pushing and pushing a little bit harder, every few weeks, up in Lebanon and up in Syria, maybe they thought this is a risk worth taking. And what they have done is they have eliminated a man who they believe is a real danger and threat to them and to the state of Israel. What happens next, the consequences of doing that, will go a long way to determine whether or not it was a risk worth taking.
I suppose the difference between then and now is that we are hearing individuals, including, for example, President Joe Biden, suggesting that it looks likely that there will be an imminent response and a significant response at that. Has that heightened tensions domestically? Is Israel preparing, obviously, for some sort of attack on its soil? I mean, dear goodness, we remember how poorly prepared they were for October 7th.
They have been preparing reasonably overtly. You don't see it when you walk around the streets, but people are aware here that some more reservists have been called up. The aerial defense units of the Israeli military have been put on higher alert. The Home Command here has given out some guidance that perhaps people want to make sure that they're stocked up with food and water in case the water supply was hit, for example. So, those things have been going on. I wouldn't say that they've put fear or panic through the country, not at all. But Israel is prepared for a retaliation, and I think we would expect Iran to carry one out. The general feeling, that the wisdom throughout the 6 months of the Israel-Gaza war has been that Iran has not really wanted to get dragged into it. The dilemma facing the Iranians now is that they have had a senior commander, a senior figure assassinated. That is a bit of a humiliation for them. So they almost have no choice but to retaliate for their own pride and their own sort of self-worth in front of a domestic audience. The difficulty is, how do they retaliate without then being a part of a downward spiral towards conflict?
I mean, I just wonder domestically in Israel if there is anything close to a growing acceptance that the spreading of violence could escalate, that we could be looking at a significant regional conflict, Israel and other pretty major players in the region. Are people there starting to consider that prospect a realistic one?
Well, I would go even further than that. And I would say that a lot of people here a lot of Israelis I know, have already sort of almost priced in an Israeli invasion of Lebanon to push back Hezbollah. And everybody knows that if that were to happen, the chances are it would trigger a far more deadly round of violence than anything they've seen in Gaza, because Hezbollah are a very formidable foe for Israel, and they have a missile arsenal that can reach far deeper into Israel and with precision than anything that Hamas have. So actually, a lot of Israelis I speak to, when you say, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think the IDF will go into Lebanon? Most Israelis I know say, no, we think that's going to happen. So they factored that in. I don't think that many Israelis probably would have their money on a war with Iran, but that is now looking like it's at least a possibility. So that will worry people because, Iran is the big enemy, and Iran sits at the center of all the web which threatens Israel.
Ali, thanks very much indeed. Given how vocal President Biden has been of late about the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and the need for a ceasefire, you might be somewhat confused as to why he was so explicit that the US would not countenance any other threats to Israel's security. Dr. Sanam Vakil is Director of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. Sanam, let's try and look at this through the prism of the United States. Just how fearful is Washington of an Iranian response and, of course, any escalation that might follow?
I think when we consider the U.S. position, certainly I wouldn't describe it as fearful. The U.S. has the most force projection in the Middle East, and since October 7th has been the balancer and enforcing deterrence to prevent an all-out regional war. But this is a real critical inflection point. The U.S. has been very strongly messaging publicly that it wasn't involved in the Israeli attack on Iran's consular facilities in Damascus. And at the same time, the United States, under President Biden, has also continued to maintain a very clear and outspoken commitment to Israel.
We can certainly separate out, can't we, Joe Biden's comments about ceasefires, about the level of violence, about the access that aid organisations have and have not had to Gaza, from the United States' overwhelming commitment to the continuity of the security of the State of Israel.
Absolutely. The state of Israel is the closest ally of the United States in the Middle East, and President Biden is very committed to that relationship. That is what keeps coming out, I think, much to the surprise of ordinary people or members of the international community. And so this is important in this key moment where there is a potential risk of an Iranian response to Israel. And the U.S. is above all concerned that regional escalation will slow down, if not fully halt, any potential progress behind the scenes on ceasefire talks and hostage release discussions.
But still, one has to presume that those most recent comments from Benjamin Netanyahu, preparing for scenarios outside of Gaza, we are preparing to meet the security needs of the state in Israel, both in defence and in attack. I mean, those will not be warmly welcomed by those in Washington, and presumably are in part why Brett McGurk, the US Middle East envoy, has been on the phone to foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, elsewhere, trying to get them to deliver this message of calm back to Tehran.
Well, I think what's really interesting about this moment since the attack on Iran's consular facilities on April 1st is all parties are very much using public messaging in very interesting ways. And Benjamin Netanyahu's statements are not surprising. He is a prime minister who has long run on the platform of security. He calls himself and is known as Mr. Security, but October 7th has fractured, if not destroyed, that image of him as a leader. And what he has been trying to do since October 7th is redress his own personal image and try and restore some semblance of security for the state of Israel. The Gaza war, which has gone on for 6 months, has not still achieved security for Israel, but simultaneously what Israel is trying to do is to push back the axis of resistance across Israel's border.
What do you think then is the likelihood that those other regional players could play a role in calming tensions?
The US and Iran do not have direct conversations because of Iran's choosing since the US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement in 2018. So these back channel messages are very important to make the US position clear. Perhaps there are behind the scenes conversations taking place to incentivize parties in the face of broader calm. And I think for Arab states as well, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, two countries that over the past few years have restored diplomatic ties with Iran, they also are not seeking a broader regional conflict. And so their role in calming tensions and prevailing on the Iranian system is certainly important.
I wonder, is there any limit to US support for Israel when on the one hand, of course, you have many people accusing Israel of war crimes in Gaza, on the other hand, facing what could well prove to be an existential threat from Iran? I suppose, as with every big foreign policy decision being made out of Washington, it depends who's in the White House.
Well, first of all, I don't think that Iran is an existential threat to Israel. Iran has built a network, the axis of resistance, that certainly sits on Israel's borders. That network has serious military power and destabilizing capacity, but I certainly don't think it's existential, particularly because Israel has the quantitative military edge in the Middle East, and that is what is motivating Iran to take a quite cautious approach. It's playing a bit more of a longer strategic game, and it wants the Axis to survive this war. And so that is what is driving Iran's caution. Certainly, I think it would be naive of us to try and estimate at this point that there would be any shifts in the U.S.-Israeli relationship since October 7th. Certainly, there have been shifts in the American electorate. There's more questioning of the durability and the value of the relationship, particularly among younger Americans. But for the time being, I don't see any shifts, and we have to see things as they are, not how we might want them to be.
Sana, thank you. We'll take a quick pause. After the break, our military analyst Sean Bell is back as we examine what, if anything, Iran does next. Welcome back. As noted, Israel can certainly take American support as a given, even despite the president's concerns about the way the Gazan war is being prosecuted. But there is an expectation in Washington, as much as Tel Aviv, that there will be an Iranian response to their strike on, let's not forget, the Iranian consulate and embassy compound in Damascus. But what might they do? Sean Bell is Sky's military analyst and podcast regular. Good to see you again, Sean. Look, we're going to talk, and we're going to talk in some depth actually, about the options that are available to Iran. But before we do so, just looking back on what happened in Damascus, already Ali Bunkall has told us of the links between this Brigadier General and Hezbollah. What are your thoughts as to why Israel has essentially tempted Iran into what we're hearing will be, in inverted commas, a significant response?
It's because it's so complicated. I have to say, when I was in the military, we used to study the region, and the more we studied, the more I realised you didn't know. So I'm always hesitant to be the wise man in all of this. I think it's pretty easy to see, though, that from an Israeli perspective, they saw the dark shadow of Iran over the 7th of October attacks. And Iran, of course, has a number of proxies in the region, been supplying weapons, training, continues to try and push Hezbollah into being a distraction. The Houthis have been very successful at causing havoc in the Red Sea. So it doesn't seem to me a leap of faith that Israel would want to make some sort of decisive strike against Iran. And the risk is that Israel would have known full well that it's provoking the beast here with a stick and would have known there's some response. And I think the danger here is that if you look at what's happening, the Israeli Defense Forces have pulled out of Rafah. Why? As a military guy, you got your foot on the throat of Hamas. Why would you let up? And it might be because a lot of Netanyahu's cabinet think this is the opportunity. Having solved Hamas, we need to solve Hezbollah, taunt Iran into providing a strike, and that gives you the license now to go into Lebanon and finally sort out the Hezbollah problem.
Wasn't that long ago that all of us were looking at Lebanon, were looking at Hezbollah, and were wondering whether or not they were about to start coming over the border?
Clearly, there was an escalation across the border, and the balance was, is this going to be something Hezbollah is being forced by Iran to take the pressure off Hamas? Or is the overwhelming desire to not drag the Lebanon into a massive war, or Iran? And actually, when we saw that it diffused, it did quieten down again. So it was evident that neither side particularly wanted to escalate. And bluntly, with Israel being the dominant military power in the region, and with Biden reinforcing the fact that even though there's been friction with Netanyahu, don't mistake that, we are still a cast iron strategic guarantor of Israel's security. That's a clear warning to anybody else in the region. Mess with Israel, and you mess with the US.
Let's just imagine for a second that the Iranians, not for the first time, do not listen to a US president telling them not to do something. What are the options at their disposal if we assume that it is a like-for-like strike? I mean, when we talk about Iran, we are not talking about, a militia like the Houthis, or indeed like Hezbollah in Lebanon, far more sophisticated. This is a properly well-equipped military, isn't it?
It is, but the danger is it makes it sound binary, as if you're either a first-rate military or you're not. There's a whole shades of grey in between. Iran, up to sort of the 1970s, was supplied by a lot of weapons by the US, and it still operates some of those weapons. It's supplied some by Russia. What it does have is one of the biggest standing military armies in the world. It's over 600,000, I think, and they've got a whole load of folks on reserve. So they can mass a pretty massive army, and they've also invested a lot of money in their cruise missile and ballistic missiles to give them an autonomous capability. So it looks likely that the sort of action that Iran would take would involve missiles, because that's the one area where they have a degree of capability. Now, some of those will be shot down, I've no doubt at all, but quantity has a quality all of its own, and therefore probably some will get through.
Is it also possible that rather than something as obvious and as identifiable, traceable even as a cruise missile attack, that we know that the Iranians have special forces, we know that the Iranians have an intelligence service? Is it possible that something not quite so obvious could be done?
It almost certainly, Iran will want to be seen to be doing something to maintain its reputation in the region, and therefore doing something in the cyberspace or something with the special forces might appear to some that Iran hasn't got the chutzpah to go out and actually attack.
We always talk about the kind of strategic bulwark that the Americans provide, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But we shouldn't forget, I mean, Israel as a nation is very, very capable militarily, aren't they? I mean, does Israel have anything to fear from a more conventional, direct conflict between Israel and Iran?
Yes, it does have a lot to fear. The trouble is with modern warfare, we're into this technology versus manpower piece. So Israel is the dominant military force in the region for technology. So precision strike capability.
Iron Dome,
the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter, stealth capability, the like. But as we alluded to earlier, if you're talking about numbers, 500,000 being able to mass almost to 1 million soldiers on the ground, that can cause a lot of problems, particularly if soldiers who don't care so much about their own lives. So there's only so far precision strike will take you. And if you end up with a war of attrition, that can end up being extremely bloody in the region. And therefore, that will be something that Israel will be worried about. Up till now, it's largely been tit for tats and kept in a measured form. I know that sounds horrible. People have died, but at least it has subsided again. The worry would be if it actually escalated. But if it was a purely technology war, Israel, backed up by the US, stockpiles of little weapons in Israel, ready for that very eventuality. And however good Iran is, technology-wise, it's nowhere near a match. And therefore, things like the F-35 strike fighters would take out most of Iran's air force very quickly. And that's not something Iran would want to happen.
I want to kind of take us back to where we started, and the direct and indirect conflict that exists between Israel and Iran. And it is always very worrying to see two nations such as this saber rattling, and often literally doing exactly that. But how would you describe the nature of the conflict between the two of them right now? New Cold War doesn't seem to cover it entirely because obviously there are flashpoints. But it does have the feel of that sort of conflict that I remember from my youth.
I wouldn't say I'm a scholar of history, but I have studied the history of the region. If you look back, the dawn of Israel as it currently was, the very next day it was attacked by all its neighbours. And because it was, a Western power had set up this country and the rest suddenly matched in. In the decade since, there's been a series of wars that have happened, but Egypt now recognises Israel. Jordan now recognises Israel. We'd started to have Saudi Arabia start to recognise
Of course,
Israel.
which many link to what happened on October the 7th.
No, exactly. I think there's a much more geopolitical solution here. And bluntly, when you look back at the war that's currently in Gaza, those two sides will never be able to find a peace. There will have to be an international effort to drive a peaceful solution, because if they don't, if they just put a sticky plaster over it, frankly, in another few years, you and I are going to be sat here talking about exactly the same conflict again.
Let's see how they respond. Sean, always good to see you. Thanks for being with us. And that is a sentiment worth dwelling on. An Iranian strike risks yet another escalation. There has, of course, been a cycle of violence in the Middle East lasting decades and arguably much longer than that. For the bloodshed to stop requires cooler heads to prevail. But in the Middle East, who is currently possessed of one of those? That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again next time.